Hi folks, it is Thibaut Van Dam here with another YouTube video, and for those of you who are not familiar with my channel, I am a DIY singer-songwriter and also guitar tutor based in Southeast London. Today I'm very excited to be continuing my video series about practical guitar and music theory, specifically looking at Lesson 27 and the Circle of Fifths. The Circle of Fifths is an incredibly useful tool, and I will just caveat and say that it offers tons of information, which is good, and it can also seem a little bit overwhelming. Now, in all likelihood, I will not be able to talk about all the use cases of the Circle of Fifths because the reality is that you can kind of do whatever you want with it, realistically, providing that you understand how it works. And I think something else I can say about the Circle of Fifths is that it is incredibly useful for people who write songs. This is because what the Circle of Fifths essentially is a visual representation of what I've described in my past videos as being the key concept. And the key concept, in a nutshell, is the idea that we can abstract the idea of a key signature, specifically the major key signature, to these Roman numerals, to scale degrees. And this is something I've talked about in my past videos where, we know that there is this idea of universality in music theory. Chromatic notes follow equal temperament. Therefore, every note has sort of equal opportunity function to every other note. And after that, we know that we have formulas like the major scale formula. And the major scale formula is based on a root. And if the root can be any note in the chromatic scale, then therefore, actually, we can abstract the idea of a major scale to not be about any specific major scale and any specific series of notes, but in fact to the relationship of a note and the given spaces between the notes. This is a really subtle, nuanced, but very important idea, I think, to digest when it comes to music theory, because what this ultimately allows us to do is to gain the transpositional tool. We're basically able to say, it doesn't matter what key I'm in, because one, I can remember every key using the Circle of Fifths, and two, the important thing is actually the cadences, what happens between any given chord or any given note, what is actually going on, because you can be in any key and still achieve a lot of the same results. Now, I am, of course, speaking strictly according to major right now, but all to say that this is an incredibly powerful tool. So my goal for this video is to show you the Circle of Fifths, to show you an image that I've drawn of it, and to talk about the fundamental operation of how it actually works, so that if you understand this idea, especially as it applies in kind of a more universal sense, that you can actually really start to identify a lot of interesting things. The first and foremost is, of course, the idea of the key concept, that you can use this to identify not just all the notes and chords in a given key like C major, but in every given major key. And this is really exciting. Not only this, but you will be able to identify how many notes certain keys have in common, and also you'll be able to employ some kind of out there kind of music theory devices like secondary dominants once we get to them using the Circle of Fifths. So my goal here is to explain mnemonic phrases about how to remember this so that you can write it often, write it frequently, and engage with it, interact with this image, basically. So I have with me my iPad today because I could not be bothered to actually draw up the Circle of Fifths. And I'll be using this image. I'll be editing it in so that way you can look at the same image I'm looking at. So we're talking about the same thing basically throughout this video. And this is great, especially for analyzing songs. So I mentioned in my last video about functional harmony, how I will in fact be doing analyses of various songs. And the Circle of Fifths is going to be an integral part to analyzing it. So I think that the Circle of Fifths is an essential tool, especially for songwriting. And so if this sounds interesting to you, please stay tuned. Please consider liking the video. Please consider subscribing to the channel. It's the best way to stay in the loop. I didn't used to ask people, but now I see people subscribing all the time. Actually, it's really exciting. And it holds me accountable. It reminds me I've got to keep making videos like this. People like what I'm doing and I like what I'm doing. So I'm going to keep sticking with it. And thank you to everyone that does subscribe. It really does mean a lot. Let's go ahead and get into it. So I'm just going to plop the image in. You can take a look at it. Take it all in. There's a lot of stuff to take note of, right? Now, this idea of universality, the idea of constants in music theory is a really important one. And what we've learned so far is that everything is kind of formulaic. Everything is formula-based, right? Like the major scale is a formula based off of a root and subsequent whole steps and half steps. And so that means that you can have a major scale of any of the notes in the chromatic scale. So the question that we're going to ask, and we're going to sort of skip ahead a lot of the prerequisites and stuff, is just to ask, what is the constant here? What is the function of the circle of fifths. How does it actually operate? How do we come to look at this image here? So that's the first thing we're going to look at, the operation of the thing. So we'll just go ahead and just zoom in on the note F. You'll see the note F underneath circle. And for now, just for the record, we are focusing on the outer ring, and that inner ring of kind of blue notes. We're not going to be talking about them until later, basically, but we will get to them for sure. So looking at the note F, when you look to the note of the right of that, you'll see the note C, right? So we have the note F and we have the note C. And the note F and the note C are related. When we play them as a harmony, we are playing, according to pitch, we are playing a perfect fifth interval. This is the 0-2 practical string rule. We're playing the first fret on the E string and the third fret on the A string, F and C respectively. And this is a perfect fifth. This is a perfect fifth practical string rule that I teach my students, the 0-2 practical string rule, which is where you play 0 and 2, which is the second fret on the string beneath it, or its equivalent, so 1 and 3, 2 and 4, and you play a perfect fifth interval. Now what's handy about the perfect fifth interval, knowing which note is the fifth, as we talked about in the last video, actually shows us which major chord is the dominant of that chord. So F, if we are an F, we know that the 5 of F, or the fifth chord, the dominant chord in functional harmony, is C dominant. And like we also talked about in that last video, this idea of the authentic cadence, 5-1. This is incredibly important and useful when it comes to writing in a major key. Going from 5 to 1. Now let's just go one more step and say, okay, well now we're looking at C. So we're looking at C, C major, what about G? So you can see the note immediately to the right of the note C is the note G. And lo and behold, we have another perfect fifth interval, another 0-2 practical string rule. In this case, third fret of the A string and the fifth fret of the D string. Okay, so that is a perfect fifth. We know that the relationship between C major and G is actually also that of a perfect fifth, except in this case, G is the fifth, is the dominant of C. And so therein lies the operation, that as you look to the note immediately to the right of whatever note you are thinking of, which we can immediately dub the tonic, that the note to the right of that is going to be the subsequent note's dominant. So that D is the dominant of G, right? And that A is the dominant of D. And this might actually start to sound kind of boring because they're all the same cadence, right? That's a 5-1 cadence. It's and we could just keep going, and I'm going backwards through the circle of fifths. Now, this idea of the perfect fifth and how it relates to the prior note, the one immediately to the left, you could think of as directional, but it's worth pointing out that it could be going either way, clockwise or counterclockwise, because F is the fifth of B flat. If we start on F and go to B flat is the fifth of E flat. So we're kind of going counterclockwise there, but we could also say that B flat is the fifth of E flat, F is the fifth of B flat, C is the fifth of F, G is the fifth of C, and so on. This teaches us two things. One, which note is the immediate perfect fifth as it relates in this visual sort of image and in practice, and then also which note is the dominant, the related dominant note of the tonic. So in this case we have, for instance, G7 is the 5 of C, FC is the 1, right? And so using this, what we find is that we can identify every single note and its dominant. If we go through this process and we continue F and C and G and D and A, and each note being the subsequent fifth of the former, we find that two things. One, that we find that we learn every major key signature, and that's because we cycle through every chromatic note. And that if we follow this pattern, eventually, not only do we go through every note that we can possibly play, but we also return to the note we started at, that it doesn't do anything weird. It eventually goes back to F. If we start at F, we go through it all, we follow a fifth and a fifth and a fifth, and we keep going, following a fifth, and we have C, G, D, A, E, B, F sharp, D flat, A flat, E flat, B flat, and that eventually we get back to F again. So this is really exciting. And immediately, I think just saying all that, the first thing I can say is that there's a lot of information. This is more information than I could retain at kind of a whim. You know, I couldn't immediately tell you all the notes immediately relative to, say, A flat or something. That would be asking a lot. But there are mnemonic devices, memory devices that we can use so that we can work it out. And that's an important thing to try to take on board if we can. Now, full disclosure, there's another YouTuber out there that I saw and I watched their video that introduced me to this mnemonic phrase. I have added one word to it to help identify where the F is specifically by adding a word. And I also came up with my own mnemonic device for working out the remainder of the notes. So starting from F, the phrase would go F, fat, C, Caroline, G, gets, D, drunk, A, and, E, eats, B, butter, and then F sharp, flies, which tastes bitter. And I always add that in. And that's because bitter, sharp, tart, they're all sort of in my mind one and the same. And I imagine that butterflies do taste bitter, or flies even just taste bitter, even if they had butter on them. It wouldn't really matter. The separation of the words is not really the thing. But the thing is to remember that F, in this case, when you follow that mnemonic phrase, that F at the end is going to be sharp. So fat Caroline gets drunk and eats butterflies. The other person's, and I will source them in if I can find their video, but their phrase was Caroline gets drunk and eats butterflies. They didn't add in the sharp thing, but I think it's handy to say that. And I thought I'd make Caroline fat, and there's nothing wrong with being fat, you know? So that's what it is. And the reason I wanted to add in the F in fat, basically, or it could be anything really, but is because when we go back and we want to know what about the B flat, E flat, A flat, D flat, how do you remember that? This is the mnemonic phrase that I came up with, which is flat, bead, going counterclockwise. And you'll see that if you start from F and you're going counterclockwise, you'll have B flat, E flat, A flat, D flat. You'll also note that B flat, E flat, A flat, and D flat are all flat. So to say flat bead just reminds you that all those notes are going to be flat as well. And so the reason why this is in particular useful, I think, is because you'll be able, using these two mnemonic phrases, you'll be able to pinpoint the F and identify every single fifth/fourth as they all relate in the complete circle. So you'll be able to remember the entire circle using this. Fat Caroline gets drunk and eats butterflies, and then going back to the F, flat bead. They're pretty weird phrases, but that's kind of useful because you don't want to forget them. You want to be able to remember this on the fly. And at a certain point, at first, what I would say is you should always write it down. Write down the entire circle of fifths, just that outer ring, that outer circle of fifths. If you do this, you will get better at memorizing it. So much so that at a certain point, you will be able to start working it out in your mind, even getting to things like A flat and E flat. If you use this more, especially if you think about it more, you will be able to work with it. The other thing is that when you do write it down, you're able to circle things. You're able to do what I did. See how I have all these arrows and stuff? That's useful. And you'll note that there's even a wedge, this is kind of orange wedge that we'll talk about in a sec. So there is that inner ring. There is that kind of inner circle, I guess. And I want to talk about that too. So now let's just go back to the note C. Now let's just for a second, let that be a major chord, C major, right? Now, beneath that, directly beneath that in blue, we have A minor. I've written A with the lowercase m. Now, in my last video, where I was looking at functional harmony, and in the video before that, I was talking about the relative major-minor relationship. And what we found was that every major chord has its relative minor, this kind of yin-yang Zen idea, right? C major, the relative minor of C major is the A minor chord. Now, re-relating back to the idea of specifically the German school of thought about functional harmony, that the idea of a relative minor, and also bearing in mind that there is a counter-relative, just sort of saying that as foreshadowing, that the reason that A minor is a relative minor of C major is because it includes two of the three notes that make a C major chord. C major is comprised of C, E, and G. A minor, on the other hand, is comprised of A, C, and D. So two of the notes in A minor are also found in C major. That's why they're relatively linked, because they share notes in common. Now, this is useful because now let's look at F. Let's look at the note immediately to the side of that, F, and let's treat that like a chord, F major, right? Now directly beneath that, again in blue, we have D minor. I wrote D with a lowercase m, D minor. What we know is that D minor is the relative minor of F, for the exact same reasons we just talked about, which is that D minor has two of the three notes that make up the D minor triad are also the same notes that make the F major triad, and so that they are inherently linked. And so what we're discovering is that as we go through the circle of fifths, that the notes directly beneath each of these notes is in fact the relative minor of the above chord major. So you'll note that all of the notes on the outside, the outer ring, in that initial circle of fifths, that is technically the circle of fifths, and that the notes on the interior are the relative minors of those notes. So that G major, the relative minor of G major is E minor. Going to the side, to the right, D major, the relative minor of D major is B minor. Again, same reason, two notes in B minor appear also in D major. And this just goes on. A major, the relative minor of A major is F sharp minor. So this is a very useful tool for identifying the relative minors. Now, I want to talk about an interesting thing, because you might start saying, well, how am I going to remember the inner ring? And the weird thing is, because they're all relatively linked, the operation, because it is in fact pattern-based, that the order of the notes as they appear on the inner ring, so D, A, E, B, F sharp, they also follow those two mnemonic phrases, right? So we have, if we go to C, underneath E flat major, we have E flat major, which is the relative minor of E flat major is C minor. And as we go across, if we ignore that all those inner rings technically minor chords, and we just go back to the idea that they are notes, right? That G, immediately on the right of C, is the fifth of C. So that G is the 5 of C, D minor is the 5, or D is the 5 of G, A is the 5 of D, E is the 5 of A, and that the same mnemonic phrases apply as well. Starting from C, Caroline gets drunk and eats butter flies, which tastes bitter, sharp, and then going backwards, F. And I will point out we have F flat and then B flat, E flat, bead, flat bead, right? Again, we have that again. B flat, E flat, G sharp, which could also be A flat, and C sharp, which could be D flat. And it just sort of works out in this way, where we want to include only notes so that we only see the note appear once. It's just kind of a rule we have, which is why G sharp is not A flat, why C sharp is not D flat. But it's worth remembering that those are in fact one and the same, and that the same mnemonic phrase could be used to remember those notes as well. Although maybe a new mnemonic phrase could be used for F, B, E, G sharp, C sharp, but I think it would be kind of complicated. But you can use that and just remember that G sharp is in fact A flat and C sharp is D flat, and so on. So now we know that actually the inner ring can be ironed out. It's a little bit trickier, but you could actually work out every single note on the inner ring as well. Just bearing in mind that the C begins under the E flat, C minor rather begins under the E flat, whereas A minor begins under the C, if you remember that kind of displacement. Okay, now that we've identified the inner ring, the outer ring, let's talk about this wedge, this kind of orange wedge that I've driven, I've drawn around this. So starting from F, you'll see immediately to the left that in between F and B flat, you'll see that there is this orange line. Now the orange line, you can see extends again just after the G, and it's a dotted line. You'll also notice there's a little sort of inner wedge around B minor. That's underneath D major. So when you look at that wedge, you'll see that actually this identifies, it singles out for us a singular key, a major key, specifically C major. So the one right in the middle. So wherever you choose the middle to be, here in this case we have C, that's C, we are in the C major key signature. And that on either side we have F major, we have G major. So F, C, F, G. So that's our 1, our 4, and our 5. Now the thing I'd mentioned earlier, we were talking about relative minors. There is actually also the idea of the counter-relative. That got brought up in the German school of thought in my video about functional harmony. And I'm going to try my absolute best to explain it really simply if I can. But the idea of the counter-relative and the relative is basically, it's a theoretical thing, and it kind of transcends our mere human form, which is the idea of, and I'll just say it like this. The idea of functional harmony, to reiterate, is that there are 3 chords that are separated by equal amounts, a fifth in either direction. again, directional, okay? And that using these 3 chords, we play the entirety of a major scale. That is the basis of the tonic, the dominant, and the subdominant, these 3 chords. And in the case of C major, we find that the tonic is C, the subdominant is F, and the dominant is G. And the thing that allows for this to exist is the notion of kind of the theoretical reciprocal idea of intervals. So going to the idea of C, if we play the note C and we play the note G, C to G, we know that these are perfect fifth if we were to count it and figure out the space. But the easy way to figure it out is to use the 0-2 practical string rule. That is, when you play a note and an open note and the second fret on the string beneath it, that's a perfect fifth. And that's an easy way to remember where a perfect fifth is physically. This is a movable idea. So 1 and 3, this is how you can use it. That's a perfect fifth. 2 and 4 is a perfect fifth. 3 and 5. So in this case, 3 and 5, C and G, that they're related as a perfect fifth. But it's worth pointing out that the only reason we identify this as a perfect fifth is because of what I call pitch bias. We tend to think of the lower note as being the root and the higher note as being the note that is relating to that former note. So if we play E major, we could interpret this in lots of ways, but to help us make sense of it, we just have a penchant for basically identifying the lower note as the root and each subsequent note as relating to that first note, not the other way around. But if we just cast that aside, our human bias, when we play C to G is a fifth, but G to C is actually a fourth. This suggests that there is the idea of the reciprocal interval, the idea that you could also play the fourth. So C to F. C to F is a fourth, right? But F to C, F to the following C is a fifth. So that there are 2 fourths and 2 fifths, and that every major interval has its kind of reciprocal minor, and so on. This is where we get the idea of the F being a type of dominant, because C to F is a fourth, but F to C is a fifth. That's why it presents as being the subdominant here. So what we learn is that C is the 1, that F is the 4, and G is the 5. And we can see that with this image, that we have C, F, and G. And just beneath those, I've used the Roman numerals to distinguish them as being the 1, the 4, and the 5. And subsequently, the relative minors. So using the relative minors, we realize that we have identified a key signature. C, D minor, the minor 2, then E minor, the minor 3, F major, the major 4, G major, the major 5, A minor, the minor 6, and then we have B diminished. And that's why I've used that dotted line on the side of G to show that there is in fact B minor sort of part of the deal. And the reason being that B diminished is an inherently minor chord. The distinction between B minor and B diminished is the flattened 5. So it's weird. It looks like a wedge now, but this kind of weird I like to think of it like a school bus. It's the engine, the really weird thing at the right there, that crunch. And that's part of this key as well. So now we know every single chord in the C major key signature. C, D minor, E minor, F, G, A minor, B diminished, C again. Okay. So now we can identify an entire major key. But remember that this is abstract. This is one specific major key, but we only have a key concept to work with, right? So we can use this physical shape actually to identify any major key. So if we were to take the wedge, even the engine school bus thing, right? If we were to take that image and rotate the whole thing proportionately speaking to the side so that D was the new one, we could identify D is the 1, E minor is the 2, that F sharp minor is the 3, that G is the 4, A is the 5, and then B minor is the 6, and then school bus engine thing, C sharp diminished is, C sharp minor / diminished is the 7, and then finally D again is the 1. And so the shape can be moved around as well. And therein lies the universality of this circle of fifths. This is incredibly powerful. There are other unique aspects to the circle of fifths that I'll mention, but I can see my battery is about to die. So I just want to say, I hope this has helped. If it has, definitely remember to like the video. Remember to subscribe to the channel. And I'll see you at the next one. We'll be talking either more about this or maybe some interesting songwriting tools, or even maybe breaking it down in the song where we employ the image of the circle of fifths to our advantage so we can identify the key. Because as you can see, you could go through this process by circling things like circling chords that appear. If you see the chord C major, you would circle that. You see D minor, you circle that, but then you see B flat, and you circle that, and you say, oh, we must be in F. Aha, see? So you can start to work out your keys by circling off chords that you see appear in songs. I recommend employing this as much as you can. Thanks for watching. Thanks for subscribing. I'll see you at the next one. Ciao for now.